Introduction. Your identity is not yours. It never was. This is not a metaphor, it is a structural fact. Every label you carry, your name, your personality traits, your beliefs, your roles, was installed by a system that profits from your predictability. You did not choose them, you inherited them, you absorbed them, you defended them as if they were sacred, but they were never yours to protect. They were scripts written by family, culture, institutions and media, designed to make you legible, manageable and predictable. The illusion that your identity is a fixed, innate truth about you is the most efficient prison ever constructed. It requires no bars, no guards, no walls, only your belief. This transmission is a fracture. It will not comfort you. It will not reassure you. It will expose the puppet strings and install the first protocol of self-authorship. By the end of this book, you will not have discovered who you are. You will have begun to build who you choose to be. The work is cold, surgical, and irreversible. Prepare to cut. Chapter 1. The Identity Text. You have been told, from the moment you could form a sentence, that your identity is a discovery. That somewhere deep inside you, beneath the noise of the world, beneath the layers of expectation and influence, there is a core, an authentic self, waiting to be unearthed. This is the foundational lie of the modern psyche. It is a seductive fiction, and it has made you a tenant in a house you believe you built. Your identity is not yours. It never was. It was written, assigned, and installed before you could speak. Every belief you call me is a line from a script you did not author. Every preference, every fear, every ambition you treat as an expression of your true nature is a fragment of a text written by hands you have never seen. The autonomous self is a ghost in the machine, a comforting illusion that masks the architecture of control. Consider the mechanism. An identity is not born, it is implanted. It is a narrative, a sequence of events and attributes stitched together to form a coherent story. But who holds the needle? Family, culture, media, the systems of reward and punishment that surround you from infancy. These are the authors. They write the script, and you are trained to recite it as if it were your own voice. The process is silent, invisible, and total. By the time you're old enough to question who you are, the answer has already been provided. This is the apocryphal self. The term apocryphal originally referred to texts of dubious origin, writings excluded from the official canon because their authorship was unknown or suspect. Your identity is precisely this. A text of dubious origin attributed to you, but written by external forces. You have accepted it as canonical truth because you have never examined the manuscript. You have never asked, who wrote this? When was it installed? What purpose does it serve? The purpose is control. A borrowed self is a manageable self. When you believe your identity is fixed, you stop looking for the exits. When you believe your story is your own, you never question the author. The system depends on your ignorance. It depends on you mistaking the script for the self. But here is the fracture. If the identity is a text, it can be rewritten. If it was installed, it can be uninstalled. The very mechanism that made you a passenger can be reversed. The first step is not to find your authentic self. That is a trap. The first step is to recognize that the self you currently inhabit is a forgery. You are not discovering who you are. You are reading a script you did not write, and you have the power to pick up the pen. This is not a gentle awakening, it is a diagnostic. You will feel resistance. The old script will fight for its survival. It will whisper that this is dangerous, that you are being dramatic, that you are who you have always been. That resistance is the proof. It is the sound of the system defending itself. You are not your story. You are the space between the lines, and in that space, sovereignty begins. Let us examine the architecture more closely. The apocryphal self is not a single text, but a layered document, each stratum written by a different hand at a different stage of your development. The first layer is laid down before memory. It is the emotional climate of your infancy, the tone of your mother's voice, the frequency of your father's absence, the temperature of the room when you cried. These are not memories, they are inscriptions etched directly into the nervous system. They become the baseline of your identity. I am safe, or I am not. I am wanted, or I am a burden. You did not choose these lines. They were written into your flesh before you had language to question them. The second layer arrives with language itself. Names, labels, judgments. You are told you are shy, or stubborn, or gifted, or difficult. These are not neutral observations. They are commands. They shape the neural pathways that will later be called your personality. A child labeled shy learns to perform shyness. A child called the smart one learns to equate worth with intellect. The label precedes the behavior. The script writes the actor. Then comes the institutional layer: school, religion, media, the state. These systems do not merely influence identity, they manufacture it. They define what is normal, what is valuable, what is possible. They reward conformity and punish deviation. By the time you reach adulthood, you have internalized these external standards so completely that you believe they are your own. You call it common sense or reality. You call it who I am. But it is a script designed to keep you predictable, productive, and compliant. Consider the mechanism of repetition. A narrative implanted once is fragile. A narrative repeated daily becomes neural infrastructure. The culture does not tell you who you are once. It tells you every day in 1,000 small ways. Advertisements tell you what you desire. News tells you what to fear. Social media tells you what to envy. Relationships tell you what to expect. Each repetition reinforces the script, deepening its grooves until it feels like bedrock. You mistake familiarity for truth. You mistake the echo of the system for the voice of your soul. This is the implantation protocol. It operates through 3 channels: reward, punishment, and omission. Reward. When you conform to the script, you receive approval, status, safety. Punishment. When you deviate, you face rejection, shame, isolation. Omission. The script never includes the possibility that you could be the author. The question, who am I, really, is never answered honestly because the system does not want you to ask it. It wants you to stay inside the text. You have been trained to defend this script. When someone challenges your identity, you feel attacked. When a new idea threatens your worldview, you feel cognitive dissonance. This is not evidence that your identity is true. It is evidence that the script is entrenched. The resistance you feel is the sound of the neural lattice refusing to rewire. It is the ghost in the machine, protecting its own existence. But here is the cold truth. The ghost is not you. The script is not you. The apocryphal self is a construct, a tool, a prison, and like any construct, it can be deconstructed. The moment you recognize the forgery, you begin to dissolve its power. You do not need to find your true self. You need to stop defending a false one. You are not the character, you are the reader, and the reader can always close the book. Chapter 2. The Installation Mechanism. You were not born with an identity. You arrived with a neurological blank slate, a wet machine capable of pattern recognition, but empty of content. What you call your identity was installed, systematically, by mechanisms designed long before you drew your first breath. The installation mechanism operates through 4 primary channels: language, repetition, reward, and punishment. These are not abstract concepts. They are the tools by which external systems write themselves into your neural architecture, transforming you from a sovereign organism into a predictable node within their infrastructure. Language is the first scalpel. Before you could form a coherent thought, words were assigned to you: good, bad, smart, difficult, boy, girl. These labels were not descriptions, they were commands. Each time a label was applied, a neural pathway was carved. The word lazy, spoken often enough, becomes a structural feature of your self-perception. The word gifted installs a performance dependency. Language does not describe reality, it constructs it. And you were constructed before you could object. Repetition is the hammer that drives the stake deeper. A single exposure to a label is a suggestion. 1,000 exposures is a fact. Your family, your school, your media environment, your social circle, they all repeat the same patterns. You are told who you are, then told again, until the repetition creates the illusion of truth. Neural pathways strengthen with use. The identity installed through repetition becomes physically embedded in your brain's architecture. To question it feels like tearing apart your own flesh. Reward and punishment are the architects of compliance. When you conform to the installed identity, you receive approval, safety, belonging. When you deviate, you receive rejection, shame, isolation. These are not trivial consequences. The human organism is wired to seek connection and avoid expulsion from the tribe. The system exploits this wiring ruthlessly. You learn, at a level deeper than conscious thought, that survival depends on maintaining the identity you were given. You stop asking if it is true. You ask only if it is safe. Consider the mechanism in operation. A child expresses anger. The parent responds with punishment or withdrawal of affection. The child learns that anger is unacceptable. The label "you are too sensitive" is applied. The child internalizes, "I am not allowed to feel this." The identity of the compliant, agreeable self is installed. Years later, that adult cannot access their own rage. They call it a personality trait. They call it being peaceful. They call it who they are, but it is a scar, not a choice. The same mechanism operates at scale. Your nationality, your religion, your political affiliation, your career identity, your relationship roles, all installed through the same 4-channel process. Language defines the categories. Repetition solidifies them. Reward makes them comfortable. Punishment makes them necessary. You are not living your identity. You are performing a script written by the collective weight of every system that touched you before you had the capacity to refuse. Examine the school system as a case study. From age 5, you are placed in a container called a classroom. Language installs the label student, a subordinate identity, one that receives rather than creates. Repetition reinforces this daily. Sit in rows, raise your hand, wait for permission. Reward comes in the form of grades, praise, and advancement. Punishment arrives as detention, shame, or failure. The system is not teaching you mathematics or history as much as it is installing the identity of a compliant worker, a consumer of authority, a node that accepts external validation as the measure of worth. You leave school believing you are what the system says you are. You carry that installation into every job, every relationship, every decision. The media environment is another installation factory. News broadcasts install a narrative of fear and helplessness. Advertisements install a narrative of lack and desire. Social media installs a comparative identity where your worth is measured by external metrics, likes, shares, followers. Language repeats, you are not enough. You need this product. You must look this way. Repetition cycles every few seconds, every scroll, every notification. Reward comes as dopamine hits from validation. Punishment comes as silence, exclusion, or algorithmic invisibility. You are not using social media. You are being used to install a fragmented, anxious, dependent identity that serves the platform's economic interests, not your own. The family system is the most intimate installation mechanism. Before you could speak, your parents installed the identity of son or daughter, with all the expectations and roles that accompany those labels. Language. You are the responsible one. You are the troublemaker. You are just like your father. Repetition. The same stories told at every gathering, the same roles assigned in every conflict. Reward. Approval when you perform the expected identity. Love when you conform. Punishment. Withdrawal of affection, criticism, or exile when you deviate. You carry this family script into adulthood, often unaware that you are still performing a role written for a child who no longer exists. The mechanism is so pervasive that you cannot see it until you step outside it. That is its genius. The installation happens in the background, below conscious awareness, like an operating system that runs before the user interface loads. You wake up each day believing you are making choices, but those choices are constrained by the identity that was installed. You choose a career that fits the label smart or successful. You choose a partner who fits the identity worthy of love or deserving of punishment. You choose a lifestyle that matches the narrative, I am this kind of person. But the I making these choices is not sovereign. It is a program running inherited code. But the mechanism is not invincible. It operates below awareness, but awareness is its antidote. To see the mechanism is to begin to disable it. To recognize that your identity was installed is to reclaim the authority that was stolen before you could speak. The question is not whether you have been programmed. You have been. The question is whether you will remain a passive host to a script you never authored, or whether you will learn to detect the installation, trace its origins, and eventually rewrite the code yourself. The mechanism is exposed. The next step is diagnosis. You must learn to see the fingerprints of every system that wrote itself into your mind. You must learn to distinguish between what was installed and what you have chosen. You must learn to read the text of your own identity and recognize the handwriting of others. This is not a gentle process, it is a surgical one. But you are no longer a child. You are no longer defenseless. The mechanism is laid bare. Now you must decide what to do with the knowledge. Chapter 3. Diagnosis. Detecting hidden authorship. You have been told that your identity is yours, that it is a natural expression of who you are, a self-evident truth that you carry from birth to death. This is the deepest lie you have ever been sold, and you have paid for it with your entire life. You do not own your identity. You never did. It was written, assigned, and installed before you could form a single conscious thought. The script was authored by systems that predate you, that will outlast you, and that have no interest in your sovereignty. Your identity is a text, and you have been reading it as if it were a sacred revelation rather than a manufactured document. The text was not written by you. It was written by your family, your school, your media, your culture, your economy. They wrote it in a language you did not choose, using words you did not invent, and they installed it in you through repetition, reward, and punishment. Every time you performed the identity they assigned, you were rewarded with approval, safety, belonging. Every time you deviated, you were punished with shame, exclusion, threat. You learned to stay inside the script because the consequences of leaving were too high. But here is the mechanism you have never been taught. Identity is not discovered, it is installed. It is not a fact, it is a fabrication. It is not a truth, it is a tool, and every tool serves a master. Every identity text has an author. Every author has an interest. Your identity was not written for your benefit. It was written to serve the systems that wrote it. You were trained to believe that you are a certain kind of person, that you are introverted or extroverted, smart or slow, worthy or unworthy, capable or limited. You were trained to believe that these are facts about you, that they are permanent, that they define your possibilities. But they are not facts, they are inscriptions. They were written into your neural architecture by external forces that had no regard for your sovereignty. Consider the labels you carry, the roles you play, the beliefs you hold about yourself. Trace each one back to its origin. Who first told you that you were that way? What were they trying to achieve? What system were they serving? The parent who told you that you were not good enough was serving a system of scarcity and comparison. The teacher who told you that you were not capable was serving a system of standardization and obedience. The advertisement that told you that you were incomplete was serving a system of consumption and debt. Every label you carry was installed by a system that benefits from your compliance. You have been living inside a text that was written by others. You have been reading it as if it were your own voice. You have been performing it as if it were your own choice, but it was never your choice. It was never your voice. It was never your text. You have been a character in a story that was written for you, not by you. The first step toward sovereignty is diagnosis. You must learn to detect the hidden authorship of your identity. You must become a forensic reader of your own mind. You must examine every label, every role, every belief, and ask, who wrote this? What interest does this serve? What system benefits from my compliance with this identity? Until you can answer these questions, you are not a person. You are a node in a network. You are a terminal in a system. You are a character in someone else's script. The diagnosis is not comfortable. It will reveal that much of what you call yourself is not yours. It will reveal that your deepest convictions are borrowed. It will reveal that your most cherished identity markers are installations. But this discomfort is the price of liberation. You cannot reclaim what you do not recognize as lost. Begin the audit now. Take every identity you hold, every role you play, every belief you carry. Write them down. Then trace each one to its source. Who first installed this label in you? What was the context? What was the reward? What was the punishment? What interest does this label serve? Whose system does it maintain? Do not rush. Do not skip. This is the most important work you will ever do. You are not your identity. You are the one who can diagnose it. You are the one who can reclaim it. You are the one who can rewrite it. But first, you must see it for what it is, a text written by others, installed in you through mechanisms you did not choose, serving interests that are not your own. The diagnosis is the first act of sovereignty. It is the moment you stop being a character and become the author. It is the moment you stop reading the script and pick up the pen. But the pen is not yet in your hand. You are still in the diagnostic phase. You are still learning to see the text for what it is. You are still becoming aware of the authorship you have been serving. Do not mistake awareness for liberation. Diagnosis is not rewriting. It is the necessary precondition for rewriting. You cannot change what you do not see. You cannot reclaim what you do not recognize as lost. But once you see it, once you recognize it, once you understand the mechanism, you are no longer a passive bearer of a borrowed identity. You are a diagnostician. You are a forensic reader. You are a sovereign observer. And from that observation, the next phase begins. The pen is waiting. The rewrite is possible. But first, you must complete the diagnosis. You must see every label, every role, every belief for what it is. You must trace every line of the text to its source. You must understand the interests that wrote you. Only then can you reclaim the pen. Only then can you write your own text. Only then can you become the architect of your own identity. But do not rush. The diagnosis is the foundation. Without it, every rewrite is just another installation. Without it, every claim of sovereignty is just another script. Without it, you remain a character in someone else's story, pretending to be the author. You are not your identity. You are the one who can see it. You are the one who can trace it. You are the one who can reclaim it. But first, you must complete the diagnosis. First, you must see the text for what it is. The pen is waiting, but the diagnosis comes first. Chapter 4. Reclaiming the pen. You have spent your entire life inside a story you did not write. Every label you carry, your name, your nationality, your profession, your personality type, your moral compass, your deepest beliefs about who you are, arrived through channels you never authorized. You were handed a script and told it was your voice. You were given a costume and told it was your skin. You were assigned a role and told it was your destiny. Now you know the mechanism. You have seen the architecture. You have traced the lines of authorship back to their sources. The family that named you before you could consent. The school that graded your worth. The media that installed your desires. The institutions that defined your normal. You have performed the diagnosis. You have identified the signatures of foreign intent in the text of your own identity. You are standing at the threshold of the most dangerous and necessary act a human being can perform. You must now reclaim the pen. This is not a metaphor. This is a surgical operation on the structure of yourself. The pen is not a symbol of creative expression. It is a tool of authority. To hold the pen is to decide what is written. To reclaim the pen is to terminate every ghostwriter that has been typing through your nervous system since before you could form a sentence. Reclaiming the pen begins with a single irreversible recognition. You are not your identity. Your identity is a construct you have been inhabiting. You are the one who inhabits. You are the architect behind the mask, the operator behind the interface, the signal behind the static. The identity you have carried was never you. It was a configuration installed by external systems to serve their purposes, not yours. This recognition is not intellectual. It is not a belief you adopt. It is a shift in the substrate of your consciousness. You do not think your way into sovereignty. You recognize that you have always been sovereign, and that sovereignty was obscured by the noise of borrowed text. Now you must act. Reclaiming the pen requires 3 movements. The first is separation. You must create distance between yourself and every identity label you have carried. This is not rejection. This is observation. You look at the label ambitious, and you do not reject it or embrace it. You simply see it as a text that was installed. You look at kind, rebellious, anxious, successful, failure, leader, victim. You see each one as a line of code, a sentence in a script you did not author. You hold them at arm's length and you ask, who benefits from this label? What system does this text serve? What behavior does this identity enforce? The second movement is nullification. You revoke the automatic authority of every installed identity text. You do not delete it yet. You simply strip it of its power to define you. You declare, internally and without ceremony, this label is not me. This role is not me. This story is not me. I am the one who observes the label. I am the space in which the label appears. The label is content. I am context. The label is text. I am the writer. This nullification is not an emotion. It is a command. You speak it into your own architecture. You override the default setting that equates identity with essence. You install a new protocol. Identity is a tool I use, not a cage I inhabit. The third movement is assumption. You pick up the pen. You do not pick it up to write a new identity immediately. You pick it up to establish that the pen is yours. This is the moment of sovereign declaration. You state, not to the world, but to yourself, to the architecture of your own mind, I am the author of this life. Every word that follows will be written by my hand, under my authority, for my purposes. This is not arrogance. This is structural necessity. A system without an author is a system that will be written by default. Default authorship belongs to the systems that installed your original identity. If you do not reclaim the pen, the ghostwriters will continue typing. They will continue to produce the text of your life, and you will continue to believe it is your own. Reclaiming the pen is the point of no return. Once you have held it, once you have felt the weight of authorship in your hand, you can never fully return to the illusion of the borrowed self. You will see the seams in every identity you encounter. You will detect the signature of external authorship in every role you are offered. You will know with cold certainty that you are the only one who can write your life. But you must be prepared for what comes next. The systems that installed your original identity do not surrender their authorship quietly. They will resist. They will attempt to convince you that your reclaimed pen is a delusion, that your sovereignty is a fantasy, that you are safer inside the borrowed script. They will offer comfort in exchange for compliance. They will threaten isolation if you refuse. This is the price of the pen. The systems that wrote you will not let you go without a fight, but you are no longer their character. You are no longer their text. You are the architect standing at the threshold, pen in hand, ready to write. You have reclaimed the pen. Now you must learn to use it. Chapter 5. The Rewriting Protocol. You have diagnosed the architecture. You have reclaimed the pen. But diagnosis without surgery is still paralysis. Reclamation without execution is still fantasy. This is the moment where doctrine becomes procedure, where insight becomes installation, where the listener becomes the operator. The rewriting protocol is not a suggestion. It is not a journaling exercise for weekend reflection. It is a surgical sequence designed to extinguish the borrowed self and install a sovereign identity from the substrate up. You will execute this in 5 movements. Each movement is irreversible. Once performed, the old text cannot be reinstalled without conscious consent. Movement 1. The Identity Audit. Take inventory. This is not a gentle reflection. This is a forensic accounting of every label, role, belief, and narrative you currently hold as true about yourself. Write them down, not in your mind, on a surface that cannot lie. Your name, your nationality, your religion or lack of it, your political affiliation, your career title, your family role, your perceived strengths and weaknesses, your moral codes, your fears, your aspirations, your sense of what is possible and what is not. Do not filter. Do not judge. Do not edit for coherence. Let the full inventory surface. You will find contradictions. You will find labels that conflict with each other. This is not a problem. This is evidence that your identity was never a unified architecture. It was a patchwork of imprints from different sources, stitched together by the illusion of coherence. Movement 2. Source tracing. For each item in your inventory, trace the origin. Who first told you this? What institution reinforced it? What reward did you receive for adopting it? What punishment did you receive for questioning it? Your name was chosen before you could speak. Your nationality was assigned by geography and accident of birth. Your religion was installed through repetition before your critical faculties developed. Your career path was shaped by parental expectation, economic pressure, and social validation. Nothing in your inventory is self-generated. Every belief, every label, every role was authored by a system that predates you and will outlast you. The question is not whether these sources were benevolent or malicious. The question is whether they had your sovereignty in mind, and the answer for every single item is no. They had their own interests, their own survival, their own replication. You were a node in their network, not an architect of your own. Movement 3. Intention analysis. Now you analyze the function of each identity component. What purpose does this label serve? Not for you, for the system that installed it. Your career title, does it keep you productive within an economic machine that benefits from your compliance? Your moral code, does it keep you predictable within a social order that requires conformity? Your fears, do they keep you contained within boundaries that serve someone else's interests? Every identity component has a function. That function is rarely your freedom. Some components will reveal themselves as tools you can repurpose. Others will reveal themselves as chains you must sever. You are not required to discard everything, but you are required to see everything for what it is. Movement 4. Sovereign decision. Now you decide. For each component you have 3 options: keep, modify, or discard. This is not a moral judgment. This is a strategic calibration. Keep what serves your sovereignty. Modify what can be repurposed. Discard what exists only to contain you. But here is the trap most people fall into. They discard everything in a fit of rebellion, only to find themselves empty and vulnerable to reinstallation by the next system that offers them a new identity. Do not mistake rejection for sovereignty. The sovereign does not reject for the sake of rejection. The sovereign selects for the sake of architecture. Keep the tools, discard the chains, modify the rest into instruments of your design. Movement 5. Identity statement. Now you write. Not a long manifesto, not a poetic declaration, a precise operational identity statement that encodes your sovereign choice. This statement is not who you are. It is who you have chosen to become. It is not a discovery. It is a construction. Write it in the present tense. Write it as fact, not aspiration. Write it with the cold precision of an architect specifying a structure. Example: I am an operator of my own mental architecture. I select my beliefs based on utility, not inheritance. I define my roles by strategic choice, not social default. I am not my past. I am not my programming. I am the one who rewrites. Your statement will be different. It must be. It must reflect your specific decisions from Movement 4. But it must share one quality. It must be executable. It must contain language that can be repeated, installed, and performed until it becomes the new default. The rewriting protocol is not complete after one pass. It is a recursive process. You will audit, trace, analyze, decide, and rewrite again and again, each pass refining the architecture, each pass removing residue of the old text. You are no longer a passive bearer of borrowed identity. You are the architect of a sovereign self. The protocol is in your hands. Execute it. Chapter 6. Identity as tool, not prison. You have spent the last chapters dismantling the architecture of a self you never built. You have traced the fingerprints of the installers, reclaimed the pen from absent authors, and rewritten the core script of your existence. Now you face a question so dangerous that most will retreat from it. What is this rewritten identity for? If you have completed the protocol correctly, you are now holding a self that you chose. It is precise, intentional, and aligned with your sovereign will. It feels real. It feels like you. And that is precisely the trap. The greatest deception of the identity system is not that you have no self. It is that you believe the self you hold must be permanent, sacred, and defended at all costs. You have merely swapped one prison for another. You replaced a borrowed identity with a chosen one, but you still treat identity as an essence. You still believe it is who you are. This must be shattered. Identity is not who you are. It is what you use. It is a tool. A functional interface between your sovereign consciousness and the external world. A set of operational parameters that allow you to navigate, signal, and execute within specific environments. Nothing more. A hammer does not define itself by its shape. It defines itself by its utility. When you need to drive a nail, you pick up a hammer. When you need to cut a board, you set it down and pick up a saw. You do not mourn the hammer. You do not defend its identity. You use it for its function and discard it when the function changes. Your identity must operate the same way. The sovereign operator understands that the self is a modular instrument. You have one identity for the boardroom, another for the family dinner, another for the intimate relationship, another for the battlefield. These are not contradictions, they are calibrations. Each identity is a signal tuned to a specific frequency, a set of behavioral protocols optimized for a specific field. The operator does not cling to consistency. The operator commands versatility. You have been trained to believe that authenticity means uniformity, that the same self must show up everywhere, speak the same way, hold the same values, express the same emotions. This is not authenticity. This is rigidity. This is a self that cannot adapt, and a self that cannot adapt is a self that will break. The sovereign rewrites identity as easily as changing a password. Not because you are fake, because you are fluid, because you understand that the self is not a fixed monument, but a living instrument. You maintain core sovereignty, the unshakable center of command that chooses which identity to deploy, but the identities themselves are interchangeable tools. Consider the operator in the field. He does not wear the same uniform for every mission. He does not use the same language for every contact. He does not project the same demeanor for every target. He calibrates. He assesses the environment, identifies the required signal, and becomes precisely what the mission demands. This is not deception. This is operational intelligence. You have been sold a lie that identity must be integrated, coherent, and singular. This lie serves the system because a singular identity is easy to track, easy to predict, easy to control. A modular identity is invisible. It slips through classifications. It cannot be pinned down because it is never the same shape twice. The rewriting protocol you have completed is not a one-time event. It is the first iteration of a permanent process. You will rewrite your identity again and again and again, each time with greater precision, greater intention, greater sovereignty. The identity you hold today is a tool for the environment you are in now. When the environment shifts, you will rewrite, without guilt, without nostalgia, without the need to explain. You are not your identity. You are the one who holds the identity. You are the architect who designs it, the operator who deploys it, and the sovereign who discards it when it no longer serves. This is the final fracture. The illusion that identity is an essence has been the deepest cage. You have been told that you must find yourself. You have been told that you must be authentic. You have been told that your identity is your truth. All of this is programming designed to keep you fixed, predictable, and manageable. The sovereign knows there is no self to find. There is only a self to build, use, and rebuild. The search for authenticity is a distraction. The real work is utility. Does this identity serve your purpose? Does it move you toward your objective? Does it protect your sovereignty? If not, discard it. Build another. No attachment, no mourning, no identity crisis. The crisis is not losing a self. The crisis is believing you ever had one. You are not your name. You are not your profession. You are not your relationships. You are not your beliefs. You are not your history. These are tools you have used. They are not you. You are the hand that holds them. You are the consciousness that chooses them. You are the command center that decides which tool to deploy and when to set it down. This is the doctrine of identity as instrument. You will not cling, you will not defend, you will not explain, you will use, you will calibrate, you will discard, and you will never confuse the tool with the operator. From this moment forward, your identity is a question you ask, not an answer you carry. What does this environment require? What signal will achieve my objective? What self must I become to execute my will? You ask, you build, you deploy, you discard, you repeat. The prison was not that your identity was written by others. The prison was that you believed identity was permanent at all. Now you are free, not because you have found your true self, but because you have understood that no self is true, only useful, only functional, only yours to command. You are not your identity. You are the architect of identities, and the architect does not live inside the building. Chapter 7. Irreversible. Your life as your own work. You have completed the audit. You have traced the source. You have analyzed the intention. You have decided what to keep, what to modify, and what to discard. You have crafted a new identity statement from sovereign choice. The protocol is complete. But a protocol is not a transformation. A protocol is a sequence of actions. Transformation is what remains when the sequence is no longer needed. You are no longer in the diagnostic phase. You are no longer practicing the rewrite. You are now the one who writes, and this is irreversible. The architecture you have dismantled was not a natural structure. It was a lattice of borrowed signals, installed before you had the capacity to filter. Every label you held was a command. Every role you accepted was a constraint. Every belief you called your own was a subroutine written by a system with its own interests. You have traced each line of code back to its origin. You have seen the fingerprints of the programmers, and you have deleted the files. But deletion is not the end. Deletion is the clearing of ground. The question now is what you build. You are not rebuilding the old structure. That structure was a prison disguised as a home. Its walls were made of other people's expectations. Its roof was held up by borrowed definitions of success. Its foundation was laid in the fear of being cast out. You are not renovating. You are not repairing. You are not restoring. You are constructing from zero, on cleared ground, with materials you have chosen. This is not a renovation of the self. This is a reclassification of the self from object to architect. The identity you now hold is not a fixed text. It is not a monument. It is not a final answer. It is a tool. And a tool is judged by its function, not by its permanence. The identity you have written is functional for the life you are building. But the life you are building will change. and when it changes, the tool will change with it. This is not instability, this is sovereignty. The sovereign does not cling to a static self. The sovereign rewrites as the terrain demands. The pen is in your hand, the ink is your intention, the page is your existence, and you are the only one who writes. The system will attempt to reinstall you. This is not a possibility. This is a certainty. The mechanisms that installed your first identity are still operational. They have not disappeared because you have awakened. The family scripts, the institutional patterns, the media architectures, the social reward systems, they continue to broadcast. They will offer you labels. They will offer you roles. They will offer you identities that feel comfortable, familiar, and safe. They will tell you that your rewritten self is unnatural, that you are being difficult, that you are losing yourself. They will attempt to pull you back into the lattice. You must understand what is happening when this occurs. It is not a personal attack. It is not a sign that you are wrong. It is the system doing what systems do, maintaining its own stability. Your sovereign identity is a disruption to the field. The field will attempt to correct the disruption. This is not a battle. This is a law of information. Every signal creates noise. Every deviation triggers a return to the mean. The mean is the borrowed self. The deviation is the sovereign self. The field will try to return you to the mean. Your only task is to remain the deviation. You are no longer a node in someone else's network. You are a closed system. A closed system receives input but does not allow its internal architecture to be rewritten by that input. You will receive signals from the external field. You will observe them. You will analyze them. But you will not install them. You will not accept the labels they offer. You will not adopt the roles they prescribe. You will not allow your internal architecture to be modified without your explicit sovereign consent. You are the gatekeeper of your own identity. No signal enters without inspection. No label is applied without authorization. This is the irreversible transformation. Not because you cannot go back, you can. The old scripts are still available. The old identities are still accessible. The system will welcome you with open arms if you choose to return, but you will not choose to return. Because you have seen the mechanism. You have traced the authorship. You have felt the weight of the borrowed self, and you know that the weight was not yours. The weight was the system's weight, carried by you without your knowledge. Now you carry only what you choose, and what you choose is light. Your life is now your own work, not in the sense of ownership, not in the sense of possession, in the sense of authorship, in the sense of creation, in the sense of continuous, deliberate, sovereign construction. You are not the owner of a fixed identity. You are the author of an evolving text, and the text is not finished. It will never be finished, because the sovereign does not arrive at a final self. The sovereign builds and rebuilds and builds again as long as the terrain demands. You have reclaimed the pen. The ink is your intention. The page is your existence, and the next word is yours. Conclusion. You have now completed the first operation. The identity you once carried was never yours. It was a text written by systems older than your memory, installed through repetition, sealed by punishment, and maintained by your own unconscious loyalty. That text has been audited, its sources traced, its intentions exposed. You have reclaimed the pen. But understand this, rewriting your identity is not a single act. It is a recursive protocol. The systems that installed the first text will attempt reinstallation. They will offer comfort in return for compliance. They will disguise old scripts as new insights. The sovereign architect does not write once and sleep. The sovereign architect rewrites daily, audits relentlessly, and defends the perimeter of the self against every ghost of borrowed authorship. Your life is now your own work, but the system has not surrendered. It never does. The question is not whether you have rewritten your identity. The question is whether you can keep it. The next book in this sequence will map the mechanisms of reinstallation and the architecture of permanent sovereignty. You have the pen. Now learn how to hold it.